Okay, thank you everyone for coming here, and I'd like to welcome you all. My name is Professor Mary Morgan. I'm the outgoing president of the Royal Economic Society, which is one of the elements that has put on this wonderful activity group that's going on today. I'd like to thank the Royal Economic Society, but also our Glasgow hostesses and Tanya, who's been organising all the wonderful groups work that you've been doing together. So I'm delighted to be chairing this lecture. I hope you had a great morning. The programme looked wonderful, and I hope you're ready now for a really great lecture. So before we start, there's a bit of housekeeping that we always do at any RES event. And I want to also notice those of you who are joining us online. We're delighted to find you involved as well. Here I want to talk about the RES commitment to a respectful and welcoming environment, which I think has its own little slide that's going to come up. Okay, thank you. So we have an RES code of conduct here, which is to create a very positive environment. And the positive environment means that everyone should feel welcome to speak, but in a respectful way. So those three little bullet points at the bottom are the kind of key points really for this afternoon: to ask questions in a respectful way. And we hope that as you're listening to Jane's lecture, you'll be thinking up some really clever questions to ask her. Ones that she can answer, of course, but clever questions. The second one is to ask for genuine curiosity. You really, this is going to be a very interesting lecture, so it should pique your curiosity to ask some things. And the second one, don't be patronizing, hostile. Third one, demeaning, or can't even read this from here.
Disruptive.
Sorry?
Disruptive.
Thank you. Need bigger print next time. Okay, so the point is that we're seeking an inclusive environment that is welcoming for everyone's viewpoint, but is respectful of everyone's viewpoint. So that's our code of conduct. There's more small print up there. Questions we will take at the end. Jane and I have agreed that we are going to save questions for the end, so we can then discuss things together, often questions kind of grouped together, so it works better to have those at the end. On questions, don't feel daunted at an event like this, that you shouldn't feel able to ask a question. I don't know whether there's a way of, it's just here that people might be writing questions down, but so writing questions down so someone can ask them for you, or we'll have some, and we will have some roving mics, because this is quite a difficult room to speak in, I know from experience, so we'll have some roving mics. If you want to ask a question at the end, please put your hand up and we'll get one of these mics to you. The other point is this is going to be a filmed event, so it's being recorded from here, so don't worry, none of your faces will be on display. That's the point to make, so don't worry if you don't want to be pictured. Your sounds may be and your questions will be, but your faces won't be. There will be a recording which will be available on the RES website, the Royal Economic Society website, and I think it's also going to be emailed out to those of you who are attending. So today's lecture is going to be by Professor Jane Humphries. Jane is the Emeritus Professor and Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, and a Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics. She has edited the Economic History Review, which is the leading UK economic history journal, and has been a member of editorial boards of many other journals in our fields. Unusually, famously perhaps, she has been president of the Economic History Society, which is the UK society, and the Economic History Association, which is the US-led one, which is a tremendous credit to her scholarship. She's published extensively on economic growth, the standard of living, labour markets, and women and children's work. And some of you may have picked up a BBC documentary called The Children Who Built Victorian Britain, which she co-wrote and presented and was voted the best history programme at the International History Makers Festival way back in 2012. I don't know if you can still find this online.
Yes.
You can still find it online, so that would be good to have that link somewhere. I think perhaps on the website. She's won lots and lots of prizes. And I think, perhaps the one that might be generally known for this audience, she was awarded a CBE for services to social science and economic history in 2018. It's pretty rare for a historian to get a CBE. So I think one should give you a sense of what a great scholar she is and her service to the community. Now, Jane's lecture is titled, Do Economists Care? I think you may have read already a little bit about this and some of the stuff that you've got for today's events. Economists' neglect of unpaid caring and household labour has long been recognised as problematic for the estimation of output and well-being. And so this lecture is going to explore why this neglect has happened and the implications of this neglect, as well as attempts to put this right to assign valuations from market equivalents. I think it's very important that to recognise the size of this gap, and if we recognise the value of caring and housework, then we realise we have actually a much bigger economy than we thought we did, just because it's so much part of what happens in life. It's just not valued enough to make it into the official statistics. So please join me in welcoming Jane to hear the lecture, Do Economists Care?
Well, thank you, Mary, for that very kind introduction. It's lovely to see you all here, so many young people interested in economics. I want to talk today about something that's very ordinary, care, and the time that goes into it. Care takes place all the time and all around us. It involves diverse tasks, many of which add significantly to well-being. It enhances productivity. However, caring work is hidden in plain sight, carried out in private households and often for free. Moreover, commercialized caring done for pay in the market, is also overlooked and undervalued. It takes a pandemic of catastrophic proportions to really illustrate the importance of care. But although we clapped for our carers not so long ago, they're already fading from our consciousness. So my task today is to identify caring's importance, both in the past and in the present, not only to provide a more complete account of ordinary life, but also to augment standard interpretations of the factors that determine our happiness and our health, and question the ways in which economists measure living standards. Let me begin with some statistics. I'm going to first introduce caring labour and the component tasks that make up caring labour. I then describe how economists and economic historians, I'm implicated in this too, how economists and economic historians have in fact indefensibly neglected domestic labour, despite its essential role in our daily life. And I'm going to sketch feminist economists' long-standing efforts to bring this work out of the statistical shadows. I argue that it's not enough to notice caring and domestic labour. We need to value it. And here, the elephant in the economist study is that most of this work is performed unpaid. Unpaid and done by women primarily. I next look at the ways in which pioneers have imputed, that is, inferred the value of unpaid work. These usually involve estimating the time spent on domestic labour and the value of that time, inferred, that is, guessed at, by the cost if a substitute worker were to be hired, or its opportunity cost if the unpaid provider were to reorientate her time to the market. The difficulties faced by economic historians in trying to adapt these approaches to a context lacking key evidence, for example, on time use, how people use their time, are also recounted. I then dive into the empirical evidence, presenting some data on maintenance costs drawn from the British historical record. These costs relate to the support of decent working people at respectable standards, and crucially in this context, include not only the cost of the goods, the commodity inputs into livings, but also the cost of the domestic labour needed to transform these commodities into consumables and so support lifestyles. These costs are then compared with the cost of a representative basket of commodities, and the differences capture the evolution of material standards. But they also reflect the extent and cost of the domestic labour involved in delivering living. Unfortunately, these two factors are conflated, and one of the difficulties is to try and tease these apart, and I'll try and show you how this might be done. I multiply, once we've found the cost here of domestic labour needed to support an individual, I then multiply that cost up to suggest the cost of the domestic labour needed to support a family, and I aggregate across all households that might be using unpaid domestic labour. So these are households that don't contain domestic servants and so presumably need the substitute labour to be provided unpaid. This then gives us an estimate of all the unpaid, the value of all the unpaid work being done in the society, in the economy. And I can relate this to, in fact, estimates of national income, and so show its relative importance. In closing, I remind listeners, you guys, in fact, that these estimates relate to only one part of caring labour provided in the past, because today I'm concentrating on domestic labour, housework. And its significance, therefore, really is just part of the significance of caring work. And I want to emphasise how, in fact, it really must be taken into account when we're talking about output, growth, well-being. And there's a possibility for serious misunderstanding if we neglect this work. Okay, so caring historically involved many different tasks from today, and I've listed some of these tasks here taken from, this list is derived from historical sources. In the past, caring work then involved many ways resembles work done today in today's global south, where it remains a particularly heavy burden in households, particularly, of course, those that lack access to basic services such as sanitation and safe water. And so I'm going to concentrate today on those caring tasks, usually denoted as domestic labour, and these are identified in bold in this slide. It was a mountain of work. And it became more onerous as families remained large, housing remained poor, domestic equipment was rudimentary, and standards were rising. Okay, well, let's time travel then back in the past. So we're going to step into a time machine and go back to England in the 1640s and pick up on one important source of domestic labour that's easily overlooked today. This is a source that's called rather delicately in my list, elimination. The Savoy Hospital, in caring for men made sick and injured in the English Civil Wars, so this is the 1640s, employed nursing sisters and subsidiary staff. A mundane aspect of the care provided involved this help with elimination. The bedridden had chamber pots stored in bedside clothes stools and supplied with tow, that's kind of rough fibres, for hygienic purposes. The key point here is that one Goody Swain, a woman, was employed to empty the clothes stools every morning and every evening, and she was paid 2 shillings a week. Outside hospitals, in all walks of life and involving all classes, somebody had to clean up after others had pissed and shit. For the elite, traditional forms of indoor lavatory, such as chamber pots and clothes stools, needed a retinue of domestic servants. Long into the 19th century, battalions of housemaids and general skivvies serviced aristocratic and bourgeois needs. You don't notice these in Downton Abbey, for example. But it took decades for technical improvements in sanitary ware to make them sufficiently attractive for inclusion within the home. And lower down the social scale, in servantless households, outdoor privies often shared continued to serve with the young, the elderly, and in fact, most people at night time and in winter, resorting to chamber pots and slop buckets, emptied and rinsed by family carers. Millions of goody swains were required to perform this function well into the 20th century, given the sluggish investment in sanitation needed to supply running water to working and even middle-class families, households. Even if water closets were provided, they often remained outside, prolonging reliance on pots and buckets and those who emptied and cleaned them. Well, goody swain is a rarity. Despite its ubiquity, this labour is rarely noted. Sources offer only occasional glimpses. Work that I've done with Roy Thomas on the basis of evidence provided by miners' wives in interviews and life writing suggest that even in the early 20th century, 7 hours of labour per week were required to cope with the particularly wretched sanitation and lack of running water prevalent in pit villages. Emptying chamber pots, carrying away slops, scrubbing out the dry lavatories, the so-called middens, and cleaning the seats of these installations. The rottenest job of all, according to one miner's daughter, but best done, quote, as often as you could, according to another. I just note here that although the workers are rarely glimpsed, it's clear that cleaning up after elimination was gendered labour. And I could cite very many examples of why I believe it's gendered labour. Okay. So emptying, cleaning out and replacing indoor lavatory ware was just one of myriad caring tasks undertaken in the past. Though its hidden status, awkward straddling between commercial and family provision, unpleasant dimensions, and relentless repetition are universal characteristics of such work. But most of this labour, as I mentioned earlier, is unpaid, and so it's ignored. Perhaps the most egregious mistake in economics. Arthur Cecil Pigous pointed this out with his reductio ad absurdum, when he pointed out that if a man married his housekeeper, national income would fall. She would be producing exactly the same labour services that he would enjoy, but national income would fall because he was no longer paying the woman for these activities. Alfred Marshall said, oh, well, we can't really manage to stretch our national income statistics, our measures of productivity and production in this way. And anyway, it doesn't really matter because women's wages are so low that our mistakes by leaving out the value of caring labour are not very considerable. Margaret Reed, an American woman economist, said, no, domestic work must count as work because it passes what she called the third-party criteria. It could be delegated. And Colin Clark actually pointed out too that many other services were provided without unpaid, but there was in fact a value imputed to those services. For instance, the services from housing. So that there are in fact other kinds of services which were included in measures of national income, measures of output. And in fact, an American economist called Ollie Halrilishin, in a survey of the Review of Income and Wealth in 1976, reported 13 relevant studies published in mainstream outlets between 1919 and 1973, using various methodologies to try and, in fact, value domestic labour. And we'll have cause to refer to these findings later. In the meantime, I'm going to reflect on the treatment of caring and domestic labour in modern economies and accounting practices. These, the ways in which caring labour, domestic labour, housework was ignored was built into, in fact, early national income accounts. So the grandfather of national income accounts, Kuznets here, he in fact decided, with some unease, not to include unpaid activities in national income. And in fact, the Nobel Prize winning British equivalent, Professor Richard Stone, Cambridge economist, who really linked national income accounting to Keynesian economics and double entry bookkeeping, also agreed to exclude this kind of unpaid activity. Early disquiet was expressed, and Phyllis Dean, my old Cambridge supervisor, really expressed considerable unease trying to fit African output data into frameworks which excluded subsistence activities. And so she really was trying to stretch national income as understood to fit some of the unpaid activities that she saw as so important in many poor countries in Africa when she was working on colonial national income statistics in the period immediately after World War II. But there was limited recognition, in fact, for this kind of activity. And although GDP was expanded over time to include some subsistence activities, like the subsistence agriculture that had really concerned Phyllis Dean, unpaid household services remained beyond the purview of national income. Feminist theorists identified women's unpaid care as a major source of gender inequality. They argued that it unpinned dependence, it gave rise to an equal bargaining power in the household, and via the care penalty, the fact that many women were in fact responsible for care within the family, that disadvantaged women in the labour force. They couldn't devote as many hours, they couldn't devote as much time and energy to paid work, and that's why they earned less than men in the labour force. Consequently, the global feminist community has long campaigned for the recognition of caring labour as work. And the UN World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995 offered support for the recognition of unpaid work. And the International Conference of Labour Statisticians recommended including unpaid household care workers as part of the labour force in 2013. But the major concession, it was to set up what the UN has described as satellite accounts. And these, the United Nations has encouraged national statistical officers to, in fact, collect data to produce accounts that go beyond the standard Kuznetian framework. But one important stumbling block here that also dogs historical endeavours is the lack of robust evidence on how people use their time, the amount of time that is devoted to domestic work. It's important to emphasise that ignoring women's unpaid care work not only involves an injustice to women workers, but it's also likely to distort our understanding of the macroeconomy. Estimates of the value of unpaid household work, including cooking, cleaning, and care, in a sample of mostly OECD, so developed countries, amounts to between 1/3 and 1/2 of total economic activity. This is not trivial. And we might expect contributions to be higher in the global south, where the commodification of women's work is less advanced. Though the replacement cost in all these contexts is likely to be low because of women's low market wages, which are used to infer the value of the time spent in care. Well, I've been critical then of economists, particularly of those early economists who developed and set up national income accounting, which dominates our understanding still of growth and development. But what about economic historians? Because surely caring labour was even more valued in the past, just more valuable in the past, just as it is more valuable in today's poor countries. Moreover, it's unlikely that the value of women's unpaid work is an unchanging proportion of GDP, as activities moved in and out of that production boundary that Margaret Reed talked about. But have economic historians done any better than economists in recognizing the value of unpaid domestic services? Well, standard economic history texts, exemplified by the volume on your right, provide no references to domestic caring labour, while historical accounts of economic development either ignore care and housework completely or treat them as constants. They are governed too, as the volume on your left is, on your right is, by the GDP, the framework of GDP, the modern framework of GDP, projected back into the past. So this neglect is underpinned by the dominance within economic history of standard concepts that rule much female domestic labour out of consideration. Conventional measures of living standards, so-called welfare ratios that some of you might have come across, use the prices of the goods contained in a standard basket of consumed commodities to deflate incomes, with no attention to the work, whether paid or unpaid, that is required to turn these commodities into the consumables that support living. So this slide shows you a traditional set of goods that is widely used now to measure consumption. And this is the most commonly used basket of consumer goods. But you notice it's just a basket of goods. Who transforms those foodstuffs into meals? Who uses the linen and thread in that basket to make mended or new clothing, lamp oil into illumination, and fuel into warmth? In fact, for much of the past, someone had to fill the basket in the first place, that is, turn earnings into commodities, and then begin the task of turning these into sustenance, comfort. There are exceptions to this neglect. For instance, historians of consumption have recognized that the use of commodities, even the consumption of food, involves significant amounts of work, of labor, to turn goods into lifestyles. So here's a quote from John Crowley: "A man's physical requirements for comfort were clean clothes, a well-appointed bed, a fire, and someone to serve him these commodities," the domestic labor that was needed. Catherine French has recently noted that as households expanded in size, as buildings became larger and were filled with more consumer durables, they in fact required more housekeeping in order to keep them orderly and clean. Gender historians have highlighted the importance of both subsistence production and caring in the early modern economy, but their accounts have stopped short of trying to quantify its value. And you can see here that in the title of this book, edited by Catriona MacLeod, Alexandra Shepherd, and Maria Agron, that in fact they're talking about the whole economy. So they are in fact including the care sector, the work that was done unpaid, and the production associated with that work. The Journal of Feminist Economics has published many studies of the importance of unpaid domestic services in the past, in the present, in countries of different sizes and different levels of development. And they publicized the empirical strategies that would enable valuation alongside illustrative examples for various times and places. While modern estimates of the value of household services can reach 60% of GDP, these are dwarfed by Colin Clark's approximations for Great Britain, which extend back into the 19th century. 90% of money national products in 1891. And in fact, Colin Clark estimated that the produce of unpaid work exceeded money national income in 1871, although this was in 1956 prices. More conservatively, the statistical inquiries of the 1920s and 1960s, surveyed by Holly Arilishyn that I talked about earlier, generally estimated housework's value as around a third of national income. So let's turn then to empirical studies. And here, this is where, you know, your economist hats really should come out. So Arilishyn identifies three conventional approaches. They're listed on the slide here. And while these approaches sketch the methodologies considered some 50 years ago, they remain the basis of modern imputations. The first, as you might see here, uses opportunity costs of labour. So we're looking at the value of housework as a product of the hours devoted to it, the wages, the opportunity cost of the individuals who are doing the housework, and the number of individuals providing unpaid household services. The second extrapolates from the costs of paid domestic servants and assumes all households that don't have access to, in fact, a housekeeper would, in fact, enjoy the services of equivalent value. And the third methodology disaggregates the work that's done in housework and prices each task accordingly. All three approaches, you might notice, require data on time use, the amount of time that is spent on doing caring work. And that's, of course, extremely difficult to get at in historical terms. I'm proposing in this talk today and in some of the work that I've recently published, a hybrid methodology that combines elements of all three approaches that I've just described, but adapted to the historical evidence. And it also draws on a methodology used by Colin Clark, who I've talked about earlier, as in fact being responsive to the need to introduce measures of value for unpaid work. Clark estimated the cost of domestic services as the costs of the complete maintenance of people in homes and institutions, minus the costs of their consumption of food, fuel, light, and clothing. And this inspires my own approach. I estimate the value of household services from a long-run and in-depth analysis of what it cost to maintain working people in the past, when for one reason or another, that support was costed and recorded. I then subtract from this complete cost the cost of the immediate inputs into maintenance, that is, the cost of the food, fuel, light and clothing, and using here one of those baskets of consumption commodities, one of those baskets that gathered goods together that went into consumption that I showed you on the slide a few minutes ago. Unfortunately, this difference conflates the costs of the domestic services needed to support living with any drift of the consumption goods away from the basic provisions included in the basket. And I try to separate these two components and control for the heterogeneity of my maintenance costs using a statistical technique called regression analysis that some of you may have already come across. And the data is drawn from a very large number of printed primary sources. This slide shows the kinds of sources used alongside illustrations. So you can see here that I've drawn many of my observations from historical account books. These are not easy to obtain and not easy to read and not easy to extract the relevant data. But you can see here that very often when workers, in fact, were fed and accommodated on site because transport systems were underdeveloped, and it saved them having to return home in order to eat or sleep. So I've got maintenance costs from a variety of sources, a very large number spread over a very long period of time. And these costs come with descriptions of the goods supply, and most importantly here, cover the services needed to turn these commodities into livings, because they include the amount of domestic labor that was needed to maintain these people. In this case, of course, those services are paid, so they're recorded in the costs, but they would also, in fact, give me an indicator of the value of unpaid services. So the slide on the right-hand side of your panel, the right-hand side of your screen, shows the decade averages of my data. And this is for men only. So this is some 3,867 observations. They're 83.7% of the total sample. I've taken out women and children here for further reflection. And this other slide on the right-hand side of your panel shows, in fact, the cost of maintenance compared with the cost of the consumption basket. You can see from the slide on the left that, in fact, the cost of maintenance tracks the costs of the consumption basket. But there's always a big gap because, of course, maintenance costs might drift away from the goods and services. They might offer more than is offered in the consumption basket, but they also include those costs of domestic labor. So they follow both in the short term and the long term, the cost of the basket, but always exceed it. And panel 2 graphs the nominal cost of the maintenance divided by the nominal cost of the basket. So we can see how many maintenances, in fact, are associated. That maintenance for respectable working men, from my data, usually cost between 1.5 and 3 times the respectability basket. So it's costing more than the basket of commodities. But decent maintenance, even at its trough, cost half again as much as the basket, implying a substantial difference in real consumption. And this nuances any apparent increase in betterment in livings implied by the monetary costs of maintenance taken in isolation, as in panel 1. Well, the trends reflect the change in consumption and price of domestic services, as well as the drift of maintenance away from those goods included in the consumption basket. And what's driving the changes? Well, first of all, and you might notice that this is associated with the era after the Black Death. If you know anything about British history, you know that this, in fact, involved decimation of the population and an improvement in living standards. So workers began to demand, in fact, white bread. And subsequently, there was a more varied diet and better accommodation. So again, the maintenance cost is drifting above the basket, and more protein, more goods, including tea, coffee, sugar, and more comfort goods subsequently in that era that we often talk about as an era of consumer revolution. And finally, more services, greater cleanliness and comfort in fact, the period following the Industrial Revolution. But as well as reflecting these changes in consumption, the relationship between the maintenance costs and the consumption goods in the basket, there are also periods of inflation, I should have mentioned this, that draw down the costs of maintenance relative to the cost of the basket. The costs of maintenance converge back to the cost of the basket as prices rise. But in fact, what I wanted to say was, and in fact, maybe this is a slide that's missing, more domestic labor is required over time. And so that's also driving the differences here between the cost of maintenance and the cost of the basket. So what we need to do now is separate the costs of maintenance from the cost of the basket and use that to identify the cost of domestic labor. And what I've done here is I've shown you that in the packages that I recorded, there are 3 kinds of packages. There's just the packaged basic food, being fed provides a baseline. Then there's, in fact, board, which offers more than food, offers daily meals in a tidy domestic setting. Then there are packages which involve lodging, which is a slightly more better accommodation. And finally, a fourth package involves washing and the laundering of clothes and the cleaning of household space. And there's a fifth kind of package also observed in my data, which is in fact involves eclectic composition, some nursing services and so on. And of course, the costs vary by package, but all include food here. Where packages really differ is in, of course, the sophistication of their composition, and that's associated with more domestic service. You need more domestic service to deliver washing, for example, than you do to deliver simple food. You need more domestic service to, in fact, improve accommodation than just provide mere board. So we might see how changes over time then require increasing need for domestic labour. Well, this is where things get a bit nerdy, because I then use a statistical technique known as regression analysis to back out the value of domestic labour from the differences between my maintenance costs and, in fact, the costs of the commodities involved in the consumption basket. And the main aim here, remember, is to identify the contribution of the costs of domestic labour. And this is shown in this excerpt from my results, which shows that women's daily wages, if they increased by 1 penny, they would actually increase the cost of maintenance relative to the cost of the basket by 0.68 pennies. And so this, in fact, suggests that if women's wages increased by 1 penny, maintenance costs would increase by 0.68 pennies. And that gives us an estimate of the amount of time and money, the value of the women's work that's going into maintenance. So the slide shows, in fact, that women's wages are positively and significantly, that's not just by chance, related to maintenance costs. And here related to the excessive maintenance costs over the costs of the commodities going into it. Even more telling are the significant coefficients when wages are interacted with the package dummies. Because remember, I've argued that those packages have different domestic labour intensities. So working women had a significantly greater impact as far as their wages were concerned if accommodation, then washing was included, pushing these maintenance costs further above the costs of the commodity inputs, as predicted by the greater domestic labour intensity. So, since a penny increase in women's mean wages would boost all types of maintenance costs by 0.68 pence, these estimates suggest that simply to process and serve food entail 2/3 of a working woman's daily hours and daily pay. Further household services, such as accommodation with its requirements to clean rooms, make beds and sort furnishings, would add more time, and washing would push the total to account for just over a working day. I can spot check the results of my statistical analysis against some actual direct estimates of what it costs to provide specific services at different points in time. Some of these are very close, as in 1805, when James Oakes paid 10 shillings and 9 pence for 41.5 days laundry for himself and his servant. That works out at 1.55 pence per day. And that's in comparison with the predicted costs from my regression equation of, in fact, 1.57 pence. Occasionally, I'm afraid, the spot checks are well wide of the mark, as when the Bronholm Priory in 1415 paid its washerwoman 15 shillings for washing for 15 monks, taking for the whole year 12 pence per monk. I think those monks must have been rather smelly, or there was a very exploited laundress. When extended from the marketplace to the home, these estimates also appear reasonable and consistent with fragmentary historical evidence on time use. For example, washing for a single man would involve 1.194 of a working woman's labour time per day. If an unpaid housewife washed just once a week, she would face a long day of work. That is 1.36 times her hours when working for wages. And a family wash would have made even more demands, but economies of scale and sharing or spreading the work would offer some respite. But not surprisingly, in fact, wash day was dreaded by working class women who all talk about the way it's onerous, the onerous work and the amount of time that has to go into it. Okay, so now I've got as far as being able to show you we've got estimates of what it cost. I've now got estimates of what it costs to provide the domestic labour for particular individuals. I now need to actually find out how many families required unpaid domestic labour so I can zero in on my unpaid, on the value of unpaid work relative to national income. So what I've used here is social tables, which are provided by some early political arithmeticians, and they're used by modern economic historians to provide snapshots of English social structure. And I'm going to assume that families that are larger than 4.5 included servants, so I'm going to exclude those families. I'm only interested in families that didn't have servants. And I'm also going to exclude very poor families because I'm going to argue that they really demand the pressure on these very poor families would mean women would go out to work rather than providing domestic services. So what I do then is I look at the number of families that needed unpaid work, and then I've argued that we would multiply up the value of domestic labour required to support an individual man to support a particular family, and I've simply doubled the value of the labour for a man to support a family. So we've got estimates of what it would cost to provide the household services needed if purchased, and the number of households requiring such services at discrete points in time. So multiplying out and dividing by total incomes provides estimates of the relative value of unpaid household services as imputed from those market equivalents of women's wages. All this is, of course, at nominal prices, and the results are shown in this table 6. It's in column 6 in this table. The main findings are that although the proportions and numbers of families requiring household services increases over the centuries, and the time needed to deliver light livings, to do domestic work, also increases as lifestyles became more domestic labour intensive, the ratios of the value of domestic labour to total incomes appears to hover around 20%, somewhat smaller than other people's estimates of the value of domestic labour relative to incomes. The reason, of course, as Marshall knew and Colin Clark underlined, was that women's day wages are very low, relatively speaking, and they lagged growth in national income. And that puts a cap on any value we might infer for domestic work. More unpaid labour was provided, and to more and a greater proportion of families, yet its total value was limited by the relative costs of this labour in the market. And I've used here women's casual day labour, of course, to in fact impute, by other ways, to impute value to the time spent in domestic work. Nevertheless, the value of unpaid household services was far from trivial in the past as today. And there's some suggestion that it actually increased over time, as we might expect, as more comfort, cleanliness, and caring were provided. Okay, so I'm getting near the end now. So discussion, okay. Well, we might want to talk about the numbers and the proportions of families requiring household services and how that increased over time. We might also want to talk about the time taken to provide services and how I've argued that that increased as lifestyles became more domestic labour intensive. But still we get the value hovering relative to GDP around 20%. Why? Why is that? Well, the value, as I've emphasised a minute ago, is limited by the relative value of women's caring labour in the market, i.e. women's wages. And our numbers, my numbers here, capture only a fraction of caring labour. Remember, I excluded poor families. I said they wouldn't have any time to do caring labour. And I excluded also middle-class families who have servants. Yet women may have spent time managing those servants. And so there might have been some value created in those households. Most importantly, of course, I've only looked here at a subsection of the tasks involved in caring, housework, by and large. And there were many other tasks on that first slide, those early slides, that were involved in caring work, tasks that were important to caring work. Most importantly, of course, childcare. So what conclusions can you take away to your studies of economics from this talk? Many of you probably resisted thinking about economics as a way to study the past. Many of you are not really, you're more interested in the present. So what does my story imply for you young economists? Well, I think you have to take on board the fact that we need to count unpaid domestic labour and caring labour more generally. Otherwise, we do misestimate total production, and we're likely to misestimate economic growth between one time period and another as that work moves in and out of households, as it might in one era be more commercialised than in a subsequent era. I have argued that the increasing necessity of domestic labour means that there's an increasing need to maintain unwaged family members, to maintain people in households who have time and energy to do caring tasks. And that translates too into our modern context, where we might say we really need more work-life balance, where life includes the provision of, in fact, caring labour. And in the past, of course, this produced pressure on men's wages to, in fact, support unpaid workers. But these are people who didn't get paid, but they certainly got work within the family. And this pressure on men's wages produced what is often called historically breadwinner male families, breadwinner families. And this also involves us in revising our understanding of the epochs of economic change here, because we might want to talk about how the consumer revolution resulted in an early version of the double shift for women. As families acquired more consumer goods, more domestic labour was required to, in fact, manage those consumer goods, to keep those goods clean, to keep them in working order, to manage the larger households that contained them, and so on. And finally, I'm going to skip this graph because I think you're all exhausted, but exposing the importance of domestic labour makes it clear that wage earners did not support household workers out of magnanimity. They needed them, and increasingly so over time, if they were to aspire to a better standard of life. So men were supporting unpaid female workers in their families, not because they were being generous or kind-hearted, but because those women were needed to, in fact, reproduce male labour. Wages had to stretch to pay for domestic service, as well as to pay for the commodities that were contained in the baskets of commodities that were consumed. And they either had to buy such services on the market, so their wages were needed for that, or they had to support family members who would provide it gratis. And Given that maintenance costs were always higher than the cost of the basket, there was pressure on men's wages to support families at these decent standards. So here is a motive for men to work hard. And that's a motive, if you think of the pursuit of domestic labour and the comfort associated with it, that is a way of telling us, here's a wellspring of effort and industriousness that we have not hitherto paid attention to. And these men who are in fact working harder and longer and more industriously in order to support unwaged women who are then providing them with the comfort goods in their household, these men are the kinds of workers who spearheaded industrialization and drove growth in periods of time in the past. So the need for domestic labour and the quest for income sufficient to support family members who could provide such labour offers an alternative lens on the wellsprings of long-run development. But finally, in thinking about care in terms of the national accounts and looking to impute its value for market equivalence, I flirt with the stereotype of the economist cynic. Somebody who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. Caring labour is essential for the production, reproduction and maintenance of both the workforce and our broader society. And in this social reproduction sense, its worth is only imperfectly and feebly deduced from those market equivalents that I have used here today. In other words, in your words, there is a huge externality involved in care, as feminist economists have long argued. To really understand care's importance requires extending our macro statistical scaffold beyond the framework of the national accounts and standardized measures of GDP, to recognize the ways in which feeding, cleaning, nursing, educating, training, socializing, and loving not only made life possible, but made life worth living in the past as in the present. Thank you.
Okay, I invite questions from anyone who'd like to prompt. Yes, here. Can you wait for the mic, please? Thank you.
Hi, Jane. Thanks for the talk. Really interesting. So I'm Jack. I'm an economist at the Scottish Government, and I work specifically in children and families analysis. So it's quite interesting to me. I wondered, have you done any research estimating how much unpaid childcare contributes to the value of unpaid domestic labour, alongside the other maintenance costs that you explored?
Well, my current project is a project actually valuing breastfeeding. I thought this was far too heavy a topic to introduce today to this audience. But it's very important, of course, to recognise historically the value of breastfeeding, which was, there is a commercial equivalent. There were, in fact, women who breastfed for money. Without breastfeeding, very many babies would have died. The mortality rate between breastfed and non-breastfed, artificially fed children was very, very high in the past. And of course, it also, breastfeeding today is recognised as vitally important in terms of creating healthier babies, preventing both acute and long-run diseases, very also important in the health of mothers. So you can also look at some of the externalities involved here. So breastfeeding is a really very good example of the ways in which caring labour really has an immediate effect in terms of supporting one particular infant, then this long-running effect of protecting that infant from later subsequent diseases. And also we know from very recent research, it improves cognitive development. So we can, in fact, infer the time taken to breastfeed babies at different points in the past, and we can also value that time in terms of looking at wet nurses' wages, which are available in certain kinds of account books. So that's one of my projects. This is done in a modern context too, I might say, because of course you can value breastfeeding in terms of a market equivalent in terms of artificial formula. But it's such an inferior substitute for breast milk that in fact, that's really a very slipshod way of valuing this particular kind of caring work. And if we value this kind of caring work by looking at human milk, which is still collected for, in fact, very delicate babies when they're first born, the value produced by breastfeeding is enormous. And this is, the breastfeeding example is really good because it echoes Pigue's reductio ad absurdum. Remember, he said, if a man marries his housekeeper, national income falls. If a woman chooses to breastfeed her baby, national income falls because she's not buying those artificial substitutes, not engaging in the market. So it's a wonderful example of, in fact, how here's an enormously important and valuable activity that's totally overlooked in our accounts.
Thank you. More questions? Yes. One here.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I'm a percent owner, and I have a question about domestic labor. Could domestic labor be undervalued due to the large consumption that makes domestic labor more of a norm for some people rather than an economical service like cashiers in shops?
Yes. You're right. Thank you. It's often just viewed simply as something that's, you know, some people choose to do it because they like to have a clean house and so on. But in fact, when we look at it in this long-term way, historically, we can see that it becomes more and more important over time. For instance, take the effects of the germ theory of health. Once that starts to percolate through social consciousness, then in fact, you would think that would lead to increased valuation for housework, because women, in fact, were affected by, Joel Mulcair has shown that working class housewives were affected by the growing evidence that dirt causes disease. And so they were, in fact, trying to protect their families by cleaning more assiduously. So I actually do think, you know, that we have to really understand the ways in which domestic labor really does provide a productive service, just like your other examples. The only difference is that a lot of housework is done unpaid, and therefore it slips below the economist's radar. It slips below that production boundary. But it's just as valuable, in fact, more valuable than very many activities which are done for pay.
Questions, please. Yes, in the middle here.
I'm from the High School of Glasgow. I just had a question. You made the point that when domestic labour was taken care of by women, men were able to be the breadwinners and able to sort of fuel the industrial revolution, etc. Do you think if we remove the burden of domestic labour, because I feel it myself as a working mum, and there's greater equity at home, what will that mean for women in the workplace then? What could that mean?
Well, of course, what we would hope it would mean is that care burden, the care penalty, as feminist economists, of course, called it, will actually begin to fade. And that will have a very profound impact on the gender pay gap, because women will be less burdened by total responsibilities for housework and childcare. But be careful here, because the epidemic not only illustrated the value of care, but it also illustrated how, when there was a care gap, because of course we couldn't call on commercialized care with quite the free abandon that we had done before, and we couldn't take stuff to laundry, we couldn't get out of our households and so on, that in fact, who picked up the gap? Who picked up the stress? Who picked up the leeway there? It was the women in households. We know that. There's study after study after study has demonstrated that it was women who did the homeschooling. You know, it was women who, in fact, did the care for elder care, another important concept here, another important burden. So I think we've got to be careful about assuming that as, in fact, households become more egalitarian in distributing work, then, in fact, that will improve women's abilities to compete in the labour force. Claudia Golding's book, Family and Career, really gives us some very good evidence on how, in fact, we really also need reform in labour markets to make workers more substitutable, so that, in fact, long hours and really long-term commitments to jobs are not totally rewarded in the way that they are now, because that actually penalises women who have to take time out from the labour force, of course, usually take time out to have children, to rear those children. So, yes, more egalitarian organisation amongst families. I'm all for it, power to it. It will make life more enjoyable, I think, for people in families, and make women's activities in the labour market likely to be rewarded more fairly. But we've got to be very careful, not just assume that this is going to happen.
Yeah, is this a following on from this question, or?
Slightly different.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Just
Jane.
before you, can I urge all of you who were here and maybe a little bit hesitant about bringing your questions, you know, one of the things you could pick up is something that Jane talked about that you'd like her to say something more about. It doesn't have to be necessarily a very focused question. So we've got lots of time, so please be coming with your questions. Sorry, go back to you.
Thank you, Jane. Your work was very focused on how the burden of domestic labour changed in the 1700s to 1800s. Now, when I look at the 1900s, I think there's possibly like great fluctuations in how much domestic labour was needed. I'm thinking about like the introduction of the washing machine. Like a story, I don't know how strong this story is that the introduction of the washing machine massively increased labour supply, and probably was a big contributor to economic growth in the 1950s, 1960s, and post-war period. Is it fair to say that trade growth in that period was possibly a significant overestimate?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, should we be less worried about lower growth rates now relative to those times?
You're perfectly right that once we go beyond the period, I mean, my study stops, in fact, after the Industrial Revolution. It stops around 1870 or something. So 19th century, late 19th century, 20th century economic history on this topic is very interesting, because, of course, this period post-World War II, you get an enormous increase in female participation rates. After it, a signal drop as well. So you get, you know, a decline after World War II, and then a boom in women's participation rates. And that's related, of course, to the kinds of, as you said, consumer durables that are replacing domestic labour in the home. Like, I think that was an implication of the earlier question. So washing machines, vacuum cleaners, all these consumer durables that help do housework, we have to remember that they also raise standards. So there are quite a few studies that show that despite having this equipment, the amount of time that's spent on domestic labour doesn't actually decline by as much as you might expect, because standards, of course, are really improving and increasing in this time period. But yes, I mean, one implication of my approach and of the general approach of feminist economists here, demanding that this work be taken into account, is that if we broaden our framework to look at well-being, then in fact, our traditional epochs and our traditional ideas of growth between time periods will probably be shaded, because we have to, in fact, see that production boundary as moving. And some activities which were done in the home move into the marketplace, they become counted in national income, and it looks like there's growth. You could tell, I mean, what about the story that, you know, in the 1960s, with in fact the development of artificial formula and the aggressive advertising of formula, you know, there is in fact a significant decline in breastfeeding associated with that rise in female participation rates. That boosts national income, but does it really boost well-being? Does it really boost our happiness? Does it even boost our health? The answer is probably no. So yeah, I take your point, and I'd love it if somebody worked on it.
More questions, please. Was here? Yes.
Thanks. My name is Neil McCallum. I'm an independent economist. I work at the OECD and various other organisations. Just like to pick up on the last point there and your conclusions. Very interesting to go with these great work. Just thinking about what your thoughts are in the future. You touched on technology there, like washing machines and such. Well, what about AI? What about innovation? What about the socioeconomic changes that are happening now? And what does that imply for measurement, recording purposes, so that we can pick up on the well-being economy, perhaps address the question of moving away from a huge externality problem to a positive multiplier effect, a whole series of multipliers to indirect and reduce. I think the same way that you're looking now at sustainability and the way that organisations are trying to capture the, if you like, the negative aspects, scope 1, scope 2. What are the implications of moving forward measurement for capturing the well-being and a new generation of GDP or this one?
A well-known economic historian called Jan de Vries argued that in the late 19th century, what became important in people's lifestyles was clusters of comfort that could only be accessed through domestic labour. They couldn't be purchased in the market. And that's part of my story, only I'm pushing that story back in time and arguing that many well-being goods are only accessible through domestic labour. And so that's why we have to look at changes over time. And what you were talking about is really actually also very important, because we need to know, well, can these clusters of well-being goods, can they be accessed in other ways than through personal services in the home? Can they be accessed through AI? It goes back to the consumer durables point too. Can they be accessed through better household equipment? The real problem here is that there are many services, well-being services we might call them, caring labours, that are simply inconceivable to think of them being provided by better equipment or artificial intelligence. And of course, one huge looming source of future demand for care is that we have an aging population. And somebody is going to have to care for more and more old people. And I don't know if any of you do any volunteer work in care homes and so on, but it's very difficult to imagine how that work might be replaced by some kinds of artificial intelligence. So we need, I think in a way, this is also another way in which caring labour is deprecated and its value is demeaned, because we think, oh, a machine could replace, you know, that woman producing care for her child, or this chemical formula can replace breast milk, you know, or some machine can kind of miraculously zap through the house and clean it all up. And it hasn't happened, and in my view, it won't happen, because there are some aspects of caring work that are essentially interpersonal and require that labour time.
Questions? Yes, one here.
I was wondering, to what extent do you think a strong understanding of economic history is a requirement for economists to do their jobs properly? Because I do economics and history joint honours, and I'm always trying to convince employers that history's made me a better economist, and I'm not sure they're always convinced.
No, indeed. Well, I have a student who was a student of mine many years ago as an undergraduate, and he says that, in fact, the history was very important, because when he now works for, is very high up in a consultancy, a well-known consultancy, you'd all recognize it, and it provides him with the ability to provide a narrative, a quick narrative to illustrate what's happening with the problem that they're looking at. So the history provides a narrative account that you can then slot in your data, your equations, your econometrics, your theory, your economists' edges. So I actually think, there are some employers out there who will appreciate the ability of historians to provide narrative accounts. Not everybody that you will be speaking to when you are trained economists and you're out there in the real world, not everybody that you will be speaking to will understand economics. So they will not all know about, your jargon, your way of thinking. And it's good to be able to produce these more participatory kinds of accounts. More theoretically, or more, let's say, more metaphysically, I would argue that some economic history is essential training for economists. I mean, how many of you would have even thought about what tasks were involved in caring work? It's very standard in labour economics to divide up occupations into collections of tasks. But dividing up caring work into collections of tasks reveals all these ways in which the tasks move in and out of production boundaries, they move in and out of market versus private provision, they move in and out of things that you need to do, things that you, in fact, might do if you wanted to. So I think economic history really is vital to economists, to give them some ideas of the limitations of thinking of production and productive activities in terms of the here and now and the market economy and advanced industrial economies. Go to poor countries and you will see a world like the world I've described. If you go to the global south, you go to an underdeveloped country, as we used to call them, then in fact you will see conditions very similar to those that I have described as characteristic, of Britain in the certainly in the 18th century.
Questions?
Good question. Good question.
Are they here? Yeah. Sorry, at the back.
First and foremost, we here from the Academy would like to thank you for the talk. We found it very informative and we are really appreciative of it. So our question here is that based on the slides in 18th to 19th century, we can see that most of domestic labor is from women. So assuming that in the next centuries to come, if that, if we don't have technology that could zap and, clean our house. So if technology doesn't replace us, if technology doesn't replace domestic labor in the years to come, what are the steps you think that can be done to ensure that that domestic labor is more distributed fairly amongst men and women, so there is not like that level of gender inequality? Thank you.
Well, this is a very good question, of course, and it echoes some of the earlier questions. The obvious answer here is that if you have more gender equality in the household, you have more gender equality in the labour market. And then if you have more gender equality in the labour market, it feeds back into more gender equality in the household. So you get a benign circle. It doesn't become a vicious circle of women are earn less than men, and therefore when couples are deciding on who should stay home and provide domestic labour and childcare, it's always the woman that does it because she earns less than the man. So that you can, in fact, access one of these circles that actually lead to improvement. And I would argue also that this probably increases people's well-being, because we know that better work-life balance is what many people desire, rather, in fact, more than higher wages. They want to be able to pursue a career, have a job, pursue a career, have an occupation that they enjoy, but they also want to balance that out by having some time for their families and for their friends. So I think that more equality in the household will itself have ramifications for the organisation of the labour market. But as I said a few minutes ago, Nobel Prize winner Claudia Goldin argues that one way in which you could improve relations between men and women in the labour market and erode that gender pay gap is if occupations, in fact, became less associated with long hours. Very often, high-flying occupations in particular are associated with people being forced to work very long hours, people being asked to, in fact, be on call for long periods of time. This is true of not just work in the economics and financial sector, but work in medicine, legal work, and so on. And Goldin argues that that, in fact, forces couples to choose between somebody whose primary responsibility is in the home and somebody who's always on calls to the labour market. And so she argues that if you can change that mode of organising work in the labour market, this will also feed through integrated equality in the household. That's in her recent book. It's called Career and Family, and it's really worth having a look at. It's very good book.
One final question down the run. I may have missed your waving arm somewhere.
Come on, don't be shy.
Yeah.
Who thought it was a load of rubbish? Come on, be brave, say.
Oh, you're coming back to a question.
It wasn't a load of rubbish. What would happen if it was paid? So, you know, you get personal independence payments, you get universal credit. What do you think would happen if we started to say, okay, your work, like maternity leave, you know, people get paid for maternity leave?
Yes, okay.
Some people do.
Yeah, you raise a very important point, because of course our public finances do recognise to some extent the externalities involved that I've pointed to. And so, you know, things like the childcare, tax allowance and so on. So I guess what I would say here is that there are, in fact, groups in many advanced industrial economies who always look at budgets through the gender perspective. So they, in fact, explore whatever is announced in the budget. How will this affect men and women separately? How will this affect single women? How will it affect single men? How will it affect households who are making that decision, as this person at the back asked me, making that kind of decision about, oh, well, she should be responsible for, you know, the household, and I'll be the person who's the high flyer in terms of the career. So we always need to remember this when we're looking at fiscal arrangements, when we're looking at how taxes are organised and so on. So, but, you know, look at the way in which children are not regarded as public goods. You know, look at the way in which the burden of raising children is imposed on private households, on men and women who are the parents. And we have to ask, should that be? Is that right? That's a very large philosophical question. And of course, there'd be very different positions in this room. I mean, I'm sure if Liz Truss were here, she'd have a very different position from me, and a very different position, I hope, from many of you.
I'm not sure we want to end on this first. Before I ask you to thank Jane for a wonderful lecture and great responses to the questions, I'm glad you were all able to be here. I hope you gained a lot from the lecture, but also the morning's events and the teaching staff. Thank you for all the schools for coming with their teaching staff in tow. Thank you to the University of Glasgow for hosting us and looking after us. I hope you have a safe trip home, but meanwhile, first, please let us thank Jane for a great lecture and great presentation.